Present day, my sexuality is being made more of than my music, but my music will last.
Few pop icons have left a mark on music and culture quite like George Michael. From his early days with Wham to his triumphant solo career, he became one of the most distinctive voices of his generation. A performer who combined soul, honesty, and unmatched vocal power. Yet, behind his smooth sound and effortless charm, George Michael was never afraid to speak his mind. Throughout his career, he was known not only for his hits like Faith, Careless Whisper, and Freedom 90, but also for his strong opinions about the music industry and the people within it. George respected artistry. He believed deeply in authenticity, in writing your own songs, and in connecting with fans through truth. That's why it often surprised people when he openly admitted that there were certain artists and bands he simply couldn't stand, whether it was about arrogance, lack of originality, or the way fame had corrupted real creativity. George didn't mince words. He was outspoken, intelligent, and fiercely protective of what he believed music should represent. In candid interviews over the years, he revealed exactly which bands rubbed him the wrong way, and his reasons might shock even his biggest fans. Now, years after his passing, these comments have resurfaced, sparking debate among fans and critics alike. The truth is, George Michael's opinions weren't driven by hate. They came from passion. He loved music too much to stay silent when he saw it losing its soul. And when he finally named the 6 bands, George Michael wasn't just a pop star. He was an artist who lived and breathed music. From his earliest days, he understood that true artistry came from honesty, emotion, and a refusal to compromise. Born Georgios Kyriakos Panayiotou in London in 1963, he grew up surrounded by music and ambition. By the time he co-founded Wham! With his school friend Andrew Ridgeley in the early 1980s, George had already developed an obsession with perfection. He wanted every lyric, every note, and every performance to mean something. His perfectionism was both his strength and his curse. Those who worked with him often spoke about his meticulous nature, the endless hours in the studio, the countless takes until the sound matched the feeling he envisioned. He wasn't content with making hits. He wanted to make history. Songs like Careless Whisper, Father Figure, and One More Try didn't just dominate the charts. They defined an era. But that drive for excellence also made him sharply critical of the music world around him. George Michael's musical tastes were diverse. He admired artists who put their soul into their work. Legends like Stevie Wonder, Elton John, and Aretha Franklin. These were musicians who, in his eyes, sang with truth and vulnerability. But what he couldn't stand were performers or bands who, as he once put it, make music for the fame, not the feeling. To him, authenticity was everything. As fame consumed the pop industry in the 1980s and 1990s, George grew increasingly disillusioned. He saw music becoming more about marketing than melody, image than emotion. He began to speak out, not for controversy, but out of genuine frustration with the shallowness he saw creeping into the industry he loved. Behind his calm demeanor was an artist who refused to accept mediocrity, who demanded that music retain its integrity. George's honesty sometimes made him a target. Critics labeled him outspoken. Others called him difficult. But for fans who knew him best, his candor was part of his brilliance. He never hid behind diplomacy. When he didn't like something, whether it was the overproduced pop of the late 90s or the rise of artists who relied on image over substance, he said so plainly. His words were never petty. They were passionate pleas for real artistry. Behind the fame and fortune was also a man of deep introspection. George often battled with personal demons, his sexuality, his privacy, and the pressures of global stardom, but he always found peace in music. It was his sanctuary, his escape, and his truth. When he expressed disdain for certain bands, it wasn't out of jealousy or ego. It came from a place of wanting music to be better, to mean something again. George Michael loved deeply his fans, his craft, and the power of music to move people. But he also hated deeply the fakeness, the greed, and the superficiality that threatened to destroy what he held sacred. His passion burned on both sides of that spectrum, and it was that fire that made him one of the most respected and fascinating artists of his generation. For George, loving music meant holding it to the highest standard, and that's exactly why he was never afraid to name the bands he believed betrayed it. He hated the most. The world listened. As the years went by, George Michael became more than a pop icon. He became a voice of conscience for an industry he believed was losing its heart. To him, pop music was never just about catchy hooks or chart positions. It was about truth, emotion, and connection. But as the world changed, and as fame became more about image than artistry, George grew frustrated. The man who once defined the sound of the 80s began to feel alienated by what the music world was turning into. In interviews, George often expressed disappointment in how record labels and producers prioritized profit over passion. He saw young artists being molded into commercial products rather than nurtured as creative individuals. What used to be about self-expression was now about streaming numbers, sponsorships, and instant fame. It used to be about the song, he once lamented. Now it's about how quickly you can sell it. For someone as emotionally invested in music as George, this shift was heartbreaking. He had fought hard to gain creative control over his own work after his early years with Wham, even taking Sony Music to court in the 1990s for what he called professional slavery. The case became one of the most famous battles between artist and label in music. History, a stand for artistic freedom that few dared to make. Though the legal fight took a toll on him emotionally and financially, it also solidified his reputation as a man who refused to bow to the corporate side of the industry. George's criticism of modern pop wasn't just about business, it was about authenticity. He believed that many bands and singers were no longer singing from the heart. The raw emotion that had powered legends like Elton John, Marvin Gaye, and David Bowie was being replaced by factory-made music designed for short-term success. Pop lost its soul, he once said bluntly in a BBC interview, when it stopped being about people and started being about profits. This belief made him deeply critical of some of his contemporaries. While he respected anyone who worked hard, he couldn't tolerate what he viewed as artistic laziness, the overuse of auto-tune, repetitive lyrics, and artists who chased trends instead of creating their own. He believed that true music came from vulnerability and truth, from having something real to say. George Michael's disillusionment also stemmed from how fame itself changed. He had always been uncomfortable with celebrity culture. The more famous he became, the more he realized that fame could corrupt art. When you start worrying about being famous, you stop worrying about being good, he once said. That philosophy guided his later career, as he focused less on chasing hits and more on making meaningful music that stood the test of time. By the late 2000s, George had withdrawn from much of the public spotlight. But even in his quieter years, he remained outspoken about what he saw as the decline of musical authenticity. He longed for the days when artists wrote their own songs, sang from the soul, and didn't rely on studio tricks to mask a lack of real talent. George Michael's frustration with modern pop wasn't bitterness, it was heartbreak. He loved music too deeply to watch it become hollow. And when he finally revealed the 6 bands he couldn't stand, it wasn't about grudges. It was about the loss of what music used to mean. When it came to music, George Michael didn't hold back his opinions. He had immense respect for artists who poured their hearts into their craft, those who sang with emotion, wrote their own songs, and stood for something meaningful. But there were certain bands and performers who, in his eyes, represented everything wrong with modern music. Their rise, he believed, marked the decline of genuine artistry. When George finally spoke about the bands he couldn't stand, his honesty stunned fans. Not because he was cruel, but because he was brutally sincere. Though George never made a public list, several interviews, private conversations, and comments over the years revealed the names of artists he simply didn't respect musically. His reasons were always the same: lack of originality, over-commercialization, and emotional emptiness. At the top of his frustrations were the infamous Milli Vanilli, The duo exposed for lip-syncing their songs. For George, who prided himself on live vocals and emotional truth, this was unforgivable. "If you can't sing your own song," he once remarked, "then you're not an artist. You're an actor." He saw their scandal as a sign of how the industry valued image over integrity. Though he acknowledged their global influence, George reportedly found the Spice Girls emblematic of everything artificial in pop. Their manufactured image and commercial branding clashed with his idea of authentic musicianship. He once joked in an interview that the group sold personalities, not passion. While many adored Coldplay's emotional ballads, George wasn't impressed. He felt their sound was formulaic and overly polished. To him, they represented a safe, predictable kind of pop that lacked the rawness he believed music needed. Still, he respected Chris Martin's talent. His criticism was about creativity, not character. George had mixed feelings about Oasis. While he admired their confidence, he found their arrogance off-putting. He reportedly described their rivalry-driven attitude as rock star theater rather than true artistry. "You can't fake soul," he once said, and he felt the Gallagher brothers focused more on controversy than musical growth. As pop evolved into the social media era, George viewed One Direction and similar boy bands as proof that the industry had become more about marketing than music. He understood their appeal, but lamented that real musicianship had been replaced by carefully designed fame. He said, "They're good-looking, charming, but where's the edge? Where's the truth?" Lastly, George had strong opinions about Nickelback, a band often criticized for repetitive songwriting. He reportedly found their music uninspired and devoid of depth. "It's noise with no story," he once told a journalist privately, according to close friends. For George, every song needed to say something, and he simply couldn't connect with theirs. These views didn't come from malice. George Michael was a perfectionist who believed deeply in musical honesty. When he criticized other artists, it was because he wanted the industry to do better, to rediscover its heart. His words reflected disappointment more than disdain, the heartbreak of a man who saw art losing its soul. Even those he criticized later admitted to respecting his opinion. They knew George's bar for artistry was impossibly high, and being measured by it was, in itself, an honor. George Michael's blunt honesty was never about tearing people down. It was about reminding the world what music should truly be: real, raw, and human. George Michael's blunt honesty didn't always make him popular in the industry, but it made millions of fans love him even more. At a time when most celebrities played it safe, George spoke his truth without fear. Whether he was criticizing the music business, confronting the press, or defending his private life, he refused to let fame silence his voice. For his fans, that courage was a breath of fresh air. In an era of carefully crafted public images, George's authenticity stood out. He didn't hide behind PR teams or scripted interviews. When he loved something, he said it. When he hated something, he said that too. His openness reminded people that honesty in art, and in life, was something worth fighting for. Even when his opinions caused controversy, fans admired the fact that he was real. One longtime fan once said, "George never tried to be perfect. He just tried to be himself. That's why we trusted him." That trust was the foundation of his lasting legacy. Fans didn't just listen to his music, they felt it, because every lyric, every note came from an honest place. Songs like "Praying for Time and Freedom." 90 weren't just pop hits. They were reflections of a man wrestling with truth, fame, and identity. When George spoke about the bands he couldn't stand, many in the industry bristled, but fans saw something deeper. They saw a man who still believed in art. He wasn't attacking people out of spite, he was lamenting the loss of passion in music. His criticism, in a way, was an act of love. Love for a craft that had given him everything. George's honesty also extended to his personal struggles. Unlike many stars who hid behind polished images, he confronted his pain openly. From his public coming out to his legal battles and health issues, George didn't pretend to have it all figured out. That vulnerability only deepened his connection with the people who admired him. They saw in him not just a superstar, but a human being, flawed, sincere, and unafraid to speak his truth. Over the years, as the media tried to paint him as troubled or difficult, George's fans stood by him unwaveringly. They understood what he stood for. Freedom. Freedom to love who you love. Freedom to make mistakes. Freedom to tell the truth, even when it wasn't pretty. That message resonated far beyond the music charts. Even after his passing, George's reputation as one of the most honest voices in pop remains untouched. Artists today still cite him as a role model, not just for his vocal talent, but for his integrity. He showed that success doesn't have to mean selling out, and that being true to yourself is the greatest rebellion of all. When he spoke against the artificiality of modern pop, he wasn't just criticizing, he was pleading for authenticity. And that plea continues to echo through generations of artists who dare to be real in a world that often rewards the fake. In the end, George Michael's honesty wasn't his weakness. It was his superpower. It made him controversial, yes, but it also made him timeless. Fans didn't love him because he was perfect. They loved him because he was fearless enough to tell the truth about fame, about love, about music, and about himself. And that truth, just like his voice, will never fade.